Mm-hmm.
It's the most all-encompassing thing. I often say I'm a journalist by day and a novelist by night.
Mm-hmm.
I work as the editor-in-chief of Utah Business, which is a business publication out where I live. And I started a newsletter on the side last year called The Novelleist. I spent 3 years writing a novel on the side of my job. That was kind of a passion project I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then I finished the book in 2020 and I started researching how to publish it.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to compile all these stats and get really depressed. I launched my newsletter in February of 2021.
Mm-hmm.
So I've had it for 1 year now.
Mm-hmm.
And now I've had 4,000 subscribers, and I've earned 10,000 in revenue. I just went paid like 4 months ago. And so I'm already starting to see that there's this model that's probably better for writers than publishing a book on Amazon or in even traditional publishing. I recently had somebody ask me like, hey, Elle, will you help me? I want to convert all of my LinkedIn posts into a book about business. And I was like, why would you do that? There's way more of a market for your LinkedIn posts than there is for a book. Like, Don't put it into a book format. Keep it on social media.
So I'll tell you what is the main focus of this interview. We'll primarily talk about the journey of how you started creating content online and how it has been. What was your expectation versus what actually happened? We want to dive deep into the minds of the creator and the creation, especially, right? But before we dive deep into the creator aspect, we also want to understand what does your life currently look like? Where did your inspiration to what you're doing right now started? We'll try and cover a little bit about your childhood too, right? So we usually start these interviews with one interesting question. How would you describe yourself to someone like a stranger, like someone unknown?
Yeah, I would say that I'm a writer. It's the most all-encompassing thing. I often say I'm a journalist by day and a novelist by night. I work as the editor-in-chief of Utah Business, which is a business publication out where I live. And I also freelance for business publications like Forbes and The Muse and things like that, covering basically startups and the creator economy. And I started a newsletter on the side last year called The Novelleist, which I'm sure we'll talk more about.
Awesome. How would your friends describe you?
My personality? I don't know. I guess I would say I'm creative. What?
Sorry?
So I guess I would say I'm creative and maybe hopefully fun.
Right. Awesome. So you started as, if I recall it correct, you studied fashion designing, right? Can you tell us, how did a fashion designer turn into a writer? Where did this inspiration start?
Well, I always knew I wanted to be creative, and growing up, I thought I really wanted to be a Broadway actress. Singing and theater were kind of my favorite thing. But then kind of when I got to college and realized that I was not a good singer or not a good actor, and everybody that's on Broadway has been like studying their whole life already, and I was just getting started, I was like, okay, this isn't maybe the right creative career path for me. And so I was just kind of looking at what major options were available at my school, and I just decided to do whatever sounded the most fun. And at the time that seemed like fashion merchandising. I was like very into Friends, the show Friends at the time.
Right.
And Rachel Green was like a fashion merchandising person. And she like got a job in France and Paris for Louis Vuitton. And I was like, well, that sounds like that would be fun. So I got my major in fashion merchandising and my minor in French. And then I didn't do any of those things after I graduated.
Right, right. But when did you realize that this was not your calling and you wanted to take up writing as a full-time thing?
Well, I always wrote a blog on the
Mm-hmm.
side, but I never thought that I could make a living doing it, so I didn't really pursue that as a career option. I kind of my first job out of school was to be an assistant buyer for American Eagle Outfitters, so I was in fashion for like the first year. And then my husband and I moved to the Bay Area, and I got an assistant buyer job at Williams Sonoma. And at the time, I was a buyer for the cookbooks division. So I was working with all these like authors and writers on getting their books sold at Williams Sonoma. And so I just started thinking, oh, well, maybe there's an adjacent career for me in writing. Like I love writing my blog, but maybe I can like somehow still be in that world for my career if on a different side of things. And so then when Williams Sonoma launched a rebrand of their catalog, I jumped on that project and like helped them revamp their catalog. So that's when I got kind of into content marketing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I did that for a tech company after Williams Sonoma for like 5 years. And then I kind of stayed in content marketing even when my husband and I moved to Utah. But then I was actually at a startup in Utah that where I was hired to do content marketing, and I actually got fired from it.
Oh.
And that's when I was like, okay, well, maybe I'll just pursue like part of the deal is when you collect unemployment that you have to like apply for 4 jobs a week. And I was like, okay, well, while I have this financial support, the only jobs I'm going to apply for are writing jobs. And
Mm-hmm.
so every week I applied for several writing jobs until I got one. And that was I got a job first for a content marketing agency and then for the Muse, which is a business publication. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what started my journalism career basically from there. Once I started writing for the Muse, then it was easy to get picked up by Forbes, and then that's how I was able to transition into my job at Utah Business.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I'm on the editorial side for quite some time.
Interesting, interesting. I would love to dive deeper into your journalism career, but I would like to understand about the blog that you started writing. What was it about? What nudged you to start? Can you tell a little bit about that?
Yeah, so um, I spent 3 years writing a novel on the side of my job. That was kind of a passion project I wanted to do. And
Mm-hmm.
then I finished the book in 2020 and I started researching how to publish it.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to compile all these stats and get really depressed. So basically, what I discovered is that in 2020, only 268 books sold more than 100,000 copies. So
Mm-hmm.
when you think about that, that's barely a market for a book. Even if you're one of the 200 some books that sell 100,000 copies, that's like such a small market compared to video or audio or any like social media post, you
True,
know?
true.
So I just started researching it, and I was just I was thinking about my own book and thinking, okay, I'm writing this gothic novel and it's decidedly niche. There's no way this is going to reach a mass market audience. So kind of my best case scenario was to sell 1,000 copies of the book. And if you're looking at selling 1,000 copies of the book, that's only, that is, and everybody's paying $5 to $10, you're not making very much money from that. And it's kind of like, well, that was 3 years of work and now it's just going to go into obscurity. But as I was researching that, I started to find all these alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
And all of these editors were telling me, you know, we don't even publish a book unless the writer already has this many Twitter followers or this many newsletter subscribers. Like,
Oh,
and
wow.
finally, by the end of my research, one editor said to me, I mean, if you're a writer, the best thing you can do is build a platform for your work, and then that can propel you to anything else, whether it's a publishing contract or maybe it's not even a publishing contract. Maybe the platform is a means to an end,
Mm-hmm.
or is an end in and of itself. And so I launched my newsletter in February of 2020. 2021.
Mm-hmm.
So I've had it for 1 year now,
Mm-hmm.
and now I've had 4,000. I have 4,000 subscribers, and I've earned 10,000 in revenue. I just
Mm-hmm.
went paid like 4 months ago, and
Mm-hmm.
so I'm already starting to see that there's this model that's probably better for writers than publishing a book on Amazon or in even traditional publishing.
Right, right. I just want to understand the timeline a little bit. So you said that, you moved out of your previous job, you were fired, and you're applying for a lot of jobs. Did you also like have a job in the side when you went and approached these publishers, or how did that happen?
I had a portfolio.
Mm-hmm.
So because I was always writing on the side, I developed uh, several articles just for Medium and stuff that I had written. So I had at least a portfolio of here's all the articles that I've written, and so that helped me to be able to get those early jobs.
Right, right, right. So the current job that you're a part of, where you're doing like the content for the Utah business, when did that happen? Like, was this after you launched your Substack, or this was before that?
No, I've been working at Utah Business for 4 years, and I launched my Substack 1 year ago.
Okay, awesome, awesome. So you mentioned that you already had like a novel. Was it novel? Was it just an idea, or you had already written the novel by that time?
So when I started at Utah Business, that was the same time I started writing my novel. And
Mm-hmm.
so I wrote my novel for about 3 years and then spent a year pitching it to agents and researching publishing strategies. And then I spent the last year launching the Substack.
Right, right. How did the shift happen? You said that, most of the publisher wanted you to have a following of your own in different social media platforms, but you decided to actually start it on Substack. How did the shift happen? What inspired you to actually move to Substack?
Yeah, so I was kind of looking at my options of where I could build a platform. And basically, as a writer, your options are kind of Twitter, because that's the only social media that's text-based, and then, or a newsletter, which is long form. And then you can also do companies like Medium or Vocal that kind of publish blogs and things like that. But Substack seemed the most natural fit because it allowed me to own my audience. I can actually build a newsletter following and then take them with me if I ever leave Substack.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the case on Twitter or Medium. If they change their algorithm, I could lose all my followers, and people could just not see my work anymore. And so I decided that a newsletter would be the best option. And so that's why I launched the newsletter. And at the time, I was just thinking, okay, I'll build a platform for my newsletter. And then maybe when I publish my book, there'll be a natural, hey, everyone, you know me already. Here's my book. But then as I was going and writing the newsletter, I realized that maybe a better opportunity would be to kind of actually publish my novel on Substack, releasing a new chapter every week for subscribers. And then making my Substack newsletter where I kind of the behind the scenes, me talking about being a novelist and figuring out how to do it for a living. And that's the part that I ended up monetizing. So now I have, I published my first novel there. I'm publishing my second novel there as well, which I'm crowdfunding using cryptocurrency. And then after they're done serializing, then they'll publish on Amazon and all the normal channels. But kind of the idea is that not only can I build a follower for my work, but I can also monetize it. So I can essentially, with Substack, you can charge subscribers for certain aspects of your content. And
Right.
so I charge $10 a month or $50 a year if you want to subscribe to be a paid subscriber. And those subscribers get extra perks like interviews when I interview other writers and other creators who are doing it for a living, resources like I researched this crazy list of agents when I was pitching my own book, and I made that available to everyone. So kind of I've developed this community of of all people that are all writers on the internet, basically, and are all trying to figure out how to make that work. And so it kind of just naturally evolved from there.
Right, right. So when you decided to pick Substack, did you do any sort of research, or did you find other writers who have done this before? Did you try contacting them? What was it like?
Yeah, so when I was getting started on Substack, there were only about 8 other people writing fiction on Substack. Most people were doing nonfiction only, and I do nonfiction too, but I was just curious if anyone was serializing fiction. And so it was a very small group. But then I wrote this article called "Could the Creator Economy Work for Fiction Authors?" And it just like went insanely viral. And all these fiction writers started hopping on the platform to serialize their books there. And it kind of created this huge community of Substack writers writing fiction on the platform. And Substack wound up reaching out to me, and I led a workshop for fiction writers. They started, they started asking some big name writers to come on the platform, like Salman Rushdie, and started really focusing on that niche. And then, and now there's thousands of us. And so we have this community, and we have a Discord server for Substack writers called Substack Writers Unite. And we all like share our best tips, best practices, and are figuring out how to make it work as newsletter writers. And so it's been really fun.
Brilliant, brilliant. It's very interesting to see, to take like a very uncharted territory. And now that, once you went into the territory, like you found like quote unquote your tribe, and now you've been able to build the community. That seems very exciting to me personally, to see this journey as a third person. One other thing that I wanted to also understand was that when you moved into Substack, like you said, you started, your primary goal was to actually gather some following so that eventually you could still publish a book, right? So at what point, at what time did you actually decide saying that, maybe I can publish my novel here, right? Or what kind of questions were inside your mind thinking that, when you decided to publish the novel on Substack itself?
Well, when I was doing all my research, what I figured out is that there's a historical case for serial fiction. So even if it wasn't really being done now, it definitely was done in the past. I mean, Sherlock Holmes, Great Expectations, The Count of Monte Cristo, all those books were serialized, and they were, a portion of the weekly newspaper was just, you would have the top page of the newspaper would be the news, and then you flip it over, and the bottom portion is like the newest chapter of The Count of Monte Cristo. And if you think about Alexander Dumas as he's serializing The Count of Monte Cristo, it was like Game of Thrones. Every time there's a new issue out, you're like, oh my gosh, did you see what happened to Edmond Dantes in the latest issue? And this was like a very viable model because he had 18 installments over 2 years. There were only about 10,000 paying subscribers to the newsletter he was the newspaper he was serializing in, and he was earning an annual salary of between $200,000 and $400,000 a year in today's dollars doing that. And I just thought, okay, well then that's a way better model. But I mean, no authors are making that now, so that's like a way, way better model than, hey, how about I come out with a book every 4 years and you pay me $5 to $10 for it, and it sees maybe max of 1,000 people reading it. Like that's just it's the wrong revenue model for novels. And so I just started to think, could that be done today? And I started looking into use cases. And there are some serial fiction apps, like Wattpad is largely targeted to Gen Z, but they have 90 million users, and they all are used to reading serial fiction. Like they get on there and read like the next chapter is out, and it's kind of like how when you watch Hulu, a show will just pop up and be like the newest episode of this show, and you go watch it. It's like that, but for books. So it's really genius. And we have Royal Road, and we have AO3 for fan fiction. So there are definitely websites where fiction is coming out serially and people read it. The problem is that on all of those sites, the author is writing them for free and they get maybe a lot of readers, but they don't get any kind of monetary value. And so what tends to happen is the writers burn out and they'll churn out content for a bunch of times and they might have 20 million people reading their novel on Wattpad, and they're making $0 for it. So it's not sustainable and they eventually have to stop. So I was kind of looking at all of this thinking, okay, but what if we did it via Substack, which allows you to actually monetize? And I did some experimentation. My first hypothesis was, what if we do it kind of exactly like the Count of Monte Cristo, where my newsletter is free, but you pay to read the book. And that got me about 45 paid subscribers. But when I reached out to all of them and asked why they subscribed, it turned out that none of them subscribed to read my book, and they were all subscribing to support my newsletter, which they loved. And so that's when I changed my strategy. I actually changed my strategy this year to, okay, now the fiction's free because everybody's used to paying for fiction free. And even if you think about the Count of Monte Cristo example, people were paying for the newsletter. They weren't paying for the fiction, or they were paying for the newspaper. So it makes sense then to kind of let the art portion be free and to charge for the value, the knowledge. And so I switched to that for this year, and I've already tripled my subscribers because of that. So I think it's like a kind of better model, I think.
Right. Interesting. So you also earlier spoke about the fact that, in all the other platforms, let's say in Wattpad, you might get a lot of readers, but you might not be able to monetize. And like platforms like Medium and Twitter allows you to get distribution and readers, but, they don't allow you to own the people who are reading your content, right? But in Substack, there's other challenge, right? Because you would have to bring the audience with you, right? What was the challenge when you thought about bringing in the right audience to the newsletter? What was the challenge and how did you overcome it?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people on Substack right now do use another channel like Twitter they gain a following on Twitter and then they try to get those Twitter followers over to Substack. But I didn't have any social media accounts when I launched my Substack, and so that wasn't really an option for me. So what I did was, and I don't really like social media that much. I find it very annoying. So because I've been a journalist now and I'm used to pitching myself, that's what I did. So I use a pitching strategy, meaning that for every article I write, I think about, okay, have there been any journalists writing about this topic recently? And then I'll reach out to like the top 15 of them and say, I saw you wrote this about Substack recently. Here's this way I'm publishing my book via Substack. Thought you might be interested in it. And that sort of developed press coverage. I had Business Insider do a story on my newsletter. I had Publishers Weekly do a story on my newsletter. I had Morning Brew mention my newsletter. So these like big outlets started mentioning my work because I was pitching them on my work. And so that developed my subscriber base. So I did have 1,700 subscribers from a past blog that I brought over to Substack, but then I grew it to 4,000 in 1 year just by pitching. And then the other portion is Substack's network. So if you think about like blogging in like the 2010s, what we used to do, and this was like before social media was a thing, but we all had WordPress blogs. We would comment on each other's blogs. You would be able to link, you could see that link to their blog. And Substack works the same way. So whenever you comment on somebody else's newsletter, it links to my newsletter in my comment. And you just can find all these other writers that way. And that's definitely, most of my newsletter subscribers come from within the Substack network.
Right.
And I did advertise too. So I did devote 2,000 of my own dollars last year to advertising, and I was made a Substack Fellow this year, which allowed me to get a $7,000 grant to invest in my newsletter this year. And so I'll be starting ads with some of that money as well for 2022.
Right. I want to understand the audience base, right? So let's say in your newsletter, the non-fiction part is about how to become a better writer, and the fiction is about like a Gothic style novel. In just a curiosity question, what I'm trying to understand is the audience for these two could be different, right? For example, I could just want to read your newsletter, read your story, and not really be a writer, right? Did you ever think about that as who could be the right audience for the newsletter?
Yes. So the audience for my newsletter is the audience for my newsletter, and that is not the same as the audience for my novel. But I also don't really think that there is an audience for my novel because, when I was writing it, I was reading Les Miserables and Dracula and The Phantom of the Opera and Frankenstein and like all those old school Gothics. And I totally wrote it in that style. And if you think about, at first I did try to really look into like, where do people who read those novels hang out on the internet? But there's just no such place. There's no like place where people who love Gothic novels hang out on the internet. And if they do, it's like a weird sub niche of them. Like I love Gothic novels probably more than anyone I know, and I don't hang out in any online place for that. So so they're definitely not the same audience, and that is something that I'm kind of trying to figure out this year because not only does my book have a very niche audience, and I think of all the people who are reading my novel right now, I'm about halfway through serializing it, and I think that there's probably maybe 5 people in my newsletter list who are like completely up to date and are just loving the novel completely. So that's very small. But I also think that that's books in general. I mean, as I mentioned, if only 200 books are seeing more than 100,000 views, and meanwhile, you think about how many social media posts see 1 million views in a year, like you're just better off, if you want, I recently had somebody ask me like, hey, Elle, will you help me? I want to convert all of my LinkedIn posts into a book about business. And I was like, why would you do that? There's way more of a market for your LinkedIn post than there is for a book. Like, don't put it into a book format. Keep it on social media. And I think that there's a lot of writers on Substack that are the same way. For example, there's a girl on there who pitched a cookbook and it didn't get any takers. But she posts recipes to her Substack for her paid subscribers. And she says it's $35 a year, the same cost as a cookbook. And she's, making 6 figures writing that newsletter, and she would never make that from a cookbook on the market. So kind of what I've been looking into now is, and once I'm done serializing my Gothic novel, I will put it on Amazon and like try to market it to other audiences. But I'm also thinking about, publishing industry is dying, and maybe there's a better way if you're into writing to get your writing out there. And so I've been thinking about things like, maybe the book itself isn't the right medium. And maybe if you're into writing, there's other mediums like my second novel I launched as an experiment on a cryptocurrency platform. And that one has made about $3,000 so far. I'm just writing it as chapters get funded. But and I also kind of want to experiment with writing for TikTok. Like if you kind of write with the medium in mind, I think you can write some interesting things that are better suited to a modern audience instead of using these 150-year-old dated models that are just not working in the modern age.
Right. How would you write it on TikTok? Can you explain that a little more detailedly?
There's a couple things I've been thinking about, but one of them is, for example, the biggest thing about a Gothic novel is that it's atmospheric. You think of castles and velvet furniture, and there's kind of like this whole aesthetic that you're putting together. And that would be really easy to put on on TikTok to say, you know, my very first chapter, she's at a plantation home, my main character. A nun opens the door and there's a man is on his deathbed on the inside. Like, it would be really fun to create some vignettes and be like, this is chapter 1. And maybe on TikTok, it's just like a hand opening a door, some like diamond chandelier earrings glistening in the light, you know, a nun's habit falling across her face. You know, you kind of can show these visual elements of the chapter. And you could almost, if you wrote a book entirely for TikTok, you could almost do the whole book that way without any words whatsoever. So I think there's some interesting people that are already kind of exploring with storytelling on TikTok that, you know, will recreate famous paintings as like a visual on TikTok and things like that. So I think there's a lot of interesting ways to explore that.
Brilliant, brilliant. I'd be very excited to see like this entire novel being converted into a sort of a TikTok style storytelling. So I want to dive a little deeper into the storytelling aspect of it. So earlier you had written novels, but with a book as a format in mind, right? The moment you move it to Substack, it has a certain, it doesn't really have a word limit, but the moment you're thinking about a newsletter, it lands in somebody's inbox, and when they open it, they probably might have only, let's say, a few minutes to glance. Did the content really change how you thought about the chapters in the book versus each newsletter? How did you deal with that, the change in the medium?
Yeah, it does affect the content a lot. So if you think about a Gothic novel, they're very slow and creeping. It's not like a fast slasher novel. Like those things are very slowly unfolding. And that doesn't really lend itself well to a serial novel, because if you're reading it in a book form, you might read 3 chapters in one night. Whereas if you're just reading one a week, like sometimes I would find these chapters and be like, oh my gosh, this is the most boring chapter. And if you could read this chapter and then read the next chapter immediately, it would make so much sense.
Right.
That this chapter was there, but as a standalone chapter, it's not beefed up enough to be standalone.
Right.
And I've talked to a bunch of people who write serial fiction on Royal Road, and they told me that what they do is basically they make each chapter a standalone story, and they make the end of each chapter end in a cliffhanger so that you want to read the next chapter. And so I definitely did not write this book that way, and I've edited it a little bit to be better suited to a newsletter format, but not entirely. It's still, I think, going to be better as a book. And so I think that's why I'm exploring now. Like, I have this novel that I want to write now, and I'm just thinking, okay, but I should think about what format I want to produce this in first before I even write it, because that will drastically change how I write it.
Right. It literally reminds me of this quote, right? The medium is the message, and the medium that we choose kind of dictates the kind of storytelling that we want to tell people.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Right. So another thing I also wanted to understand, when you're publishing this story in a serial format, you're also getting like real-time feedback. Like you had earlier mentioned that, other Substack writers come and comment. Now, does the comment affect the flow of the story as you're writing?
I haven't seen very many comments on my book. I've seen maybe 5. People are not interested in commenting on fiction, and this is kind of across the board. If you ask anybody who's serializing content on Substack right now, they'll all say the same thing, like there's no comments. And then it's so funny, I'll post a nonfiction article and see 200 comments. So I think just there's not a lot to comment on when it's a story, because there's no idea you're sharing that people can agree or disagree with. It's just like the story.
Right. So you had now when I saw your Substack, you had few of the chapters open for everyone to read, and a few of the chapters were behind paywall, right? Is that decision something that you took recently, or was that always been that way?
I was trying to model it after the Railroad Patreon model. So if you look at, there's something like 15 writers who are making a full-time living, like at least 6 grand or up
Mm-hmm.
a month from their writing fiction on Patreon.
Mm-hmm.
And I went and interviewed as many of them as I could, and I just was asking them, like, how did you do this? What is the way that you set this up to make this work? And basically the model that they use is they write the fiction on Royal Road, and that's free for everyone. But if you want to be caught up, like, then you need to pay for the Patreon. So you might have, you might get to a cliffhanger and you can see that there's 4 more chapters of the book ahead of you, but you don't have access to them because they're paid only. You can wait and get them 1 week at a time, or you can pay and you'll have access to the next 4 and be caught up with the author.
Right.
And so originally I launched my Substack to be the same thing. And I said, okay, the first 4 are free to everyone. After that, you have to pay. And that was kind of the only option available to Substack. But thankfully, Substack just released a new feature specifically for fiction writers that allows you to do that Patreon model where, so now I can schedule a chapter and say 4 weeks later, unlock this for free people. So now that's what I'm using. That wasn't available when I started serializing my book, but it is now. So now you can read my whole book free on Substack, except for the last 4 chapters, and then you can pay to get if you want to be caught up.
Brilliant, brilliant. Now, you had also mentioned that you get a lot more engagement in nonfiction. In your previous work, you had also dabbled with a lot of nonfiction work when you worked for a lot of companies and you've been a journalist. And now there is this fiction which is your passion, and you have also said that there's probably not much like readers for this. I was able to hear me?
Oh, I hear you.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry. Let me repeat what I was trying to say. So in the earlier you had also mentioned that you were a journalist, and so you have a lot of exposure into writing nonfiction content. And you also said that for the genre that you are interested in, probably the readership is less. Did you ever think about writing a nonfiction book so that you could monetize on the people who are engaging with your Substack more?
Yes, so I'm actually querying a nonfiction book now, or I'm actually finishing up a book proposal for it, and then I'll start querying it hopefully in February. But it's more based off of my work at Utah Business, where it kind of talks about the growth of the Utah tech scene and kind of the religion that made that all happen. So I'm pitching that as a book idea, but I also think that maybe has its own audience. So kind of what I've realized is that, my newsletter is called The Novelleist, and the way I'm thinking about it is I'm writing all these novels and books that will each have their own audience. But what the newsletter is the behind the scenes of what it's like to be a novelist. And so I might publish my book through a company that will get it access to like tech readers. But then people might come to my newsletter to see, here's the book proposal I used that won me a publishing deal, and I'll share that.
Right.
I'll expose the whole process.
Right, right.
So the newsletter is really like the behind the scenes of my work as a writer. And then my writing can go all over the place.
Right, interesting. You also talked about having like another book written on Mirror. How did the jump from Web 2 to Web 3 happen? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So that was just an experiment because I wanted to explore whether there was a world in which Web 3 could fund fiction. And there was one writer who did it, Emily Seagal. She raised something like 80 grand in Ethereum which was, I think, like 25 ETH at the time, to write a young adult novel. And I was just curious because with NFTs starting to be a thing, and you see kind of these uber wealthy tech elites spending $20,000 on like an NFT that's like a piece of graphic art. I just thought, oh, well, I wonder if that would be interesting to get them involved in a book the same way that they're involved in art. And so Mirror is a platform specifically for writers, and it allows writers to crowdfund their writing and then to mint it as NFTs. And so I jumped on that and I came out with a novel idea that was specific to the platform. So like I said, writing for the medium. And so if you think about who's interested in Web3 and investing in NFTs, it's like a Uber tech set who's very fascinated by the metaverse.
Yeah.
I wrote the prologue of a book called The Totally True Story of Scott Paul. And it's a fictional biography of this actual guy named Scott Paul, who's a big angel investor in the Web3 world. And I kind of placed him as the main character. And then I wrote this quirky novel that takes place in the metaverse. And it's kind of this battle between Mormonism and the Web3 world in the metaverse. Right. And so I launched the first chapter, and then Scott Paul himself bought the first chapter as an NFT. So I wrote that, minted it as an NFT, and then gave it to him as the backer. And then since then, I've had like 4 other backers contribute to the project. And so then after that, I wrote chapter 2. And now I'm writing chapter 3 right now, which will come out next week. And then just as that continues to get funded, I'll just keep writing it. And so really what it is it's a experiment, almost like performance art piece, to try to figure out how Web3 could work for NFT novels in the future. And so I wrote an article about kind of documenting my experience with that for my newsletter to show as an example of like, here's how we could be funding artwork in the future.
Right. This brings me to this interesting post that you had recently written, which talks about how you're changing the strategy for 2022. And I believe like some of these experiments that you had done last year is adding to that post. Can you take us through the themes and the hypotheses that you had written in that blog post? It was definitely very interesting, but I would love to hear it from your own words.
Yeah, so I think my original hypothesis was I'll develop a fan base for my work, and people will follow me because they're following my fiction. And my conclusion was actually that I didn't develop a fan base for my fiction. I developed a community of writers who were all writing together and figuring this out together. And so that has changed how I look at my newsletter now. It's not me talking to fans of my work. It's me talking to other writers who are all figuring this out together. Right. And then that also changed how I monetized it, because instead of charging for my fiction, I'm now charging for my nonfiction, and making the fiction free and kind of my newsletter free. And so that's been an adjustment that I think really changed my newsletter a lot. And then kind of my other hypothesis was originally I thought I was going to have to build up a big social media following to get subscribers to my newsletter. And I didn't do that at all. And so I kind of realized that I think I can continue to grow my newsletter solely from pitching and through community with other writers, and don't need to develop a social media fan base on its own.
Right. So do you also see that, this is going to be the future for writers and writing and reading? Or do you think that, this is going to be a niche set of audience, but the traditional book publishing and the book readers are going to go on?
I think that traditional publishing is dying. And whenever I say this, people are always like, oh, but it's a $20 billion a year industry. And I'm like, yeah, but so is radio. Like radio is a $20 billion industry too. And the problem is that we know radio is dying because nobody really listens to it anymore. And compared to other formats, it's so small, but book publishing has survived on prestige alone. I mean, because books have a certain, just a prestige about them, and they feel like this academic and like beautiful accomplishment to write a book. We still think of them as the best way to do, like the ultimate, like as a writer, my ultimate goal should be to write a book, like that's the big masterpiece. But I think that we need to stop thinking about it that way because you can sell your book to a big five publishing house. You can get a $15,000 advance on your novel and have a Penguin publishing contract, and you can win an award, and you can say, look, I made it on the New York Times bestseller list, and I have a Penguin publishing title on my book, and people will be like, wow, that's so prestigious. You really made it as a writer. But when you look behind the scenes, you realize, okay, but they only sold a couple thousand copies of their book. I mean, you can get on the New York Times bestseller list by selling as low as 2,000 copies, or above up to 10,000 copies, depending on the week and where other books sit. So I think if you're oh, I sold 2,000 copies of my book and I made the New York Times bestseller list, it's well, that's an accomplishment, certainly, but it's not very good for the author. As an artist, as somebody who spent years, many people spend 5 years writing a book, and to sell 2,000 copies, and that's the big accomplishment. That's just it's not that big of an accomplishment. I think we should strive for something better as a writer. I think we should look for better opportunities for our writing. And so that's kind of what I'm looking at is, what are the better opportunities for writers today? I'm not going to stick to writing the way that people wrote in the 18th century. It's just not going to work out.
Right. So does that mean that you're also open to exploring new ways of storytelling, like you talked about in TikTok, or maybe are you planning to also do something on YouTube? Is that also in the charts, or are you trying to stick to written text as a medium?
I don't know. One of the things I've been thinking about is I've started to think about my newsletter as performance art for writing. So it's almost and it is kind of strange because the writing isn't as important as how I publish it, because kind of what was interesting about my first novel to everyone was not that I wrote a Gothic novel, it was that I published it on Substack. That was the big exciting thing to everybody, and why news sources wanted to cover it. Same with the crypto novel. There are a couple people reading that novel, but mostly people are interested in the fact that it was published via a Web3 platform. I think the same thing is true if I publish via TikTok, if I wherever I publish. But that's also kind of fun for me because I can explore all these different avenues. I can kind of write these pieces, and then that is an experiment that I'm running. And then I get to write about that process for my newsletter and share what I've learned. And that's kind of just as fun for me too. So it's not like I'm stuck to, oh, I need to write fiction and that's my most favorite thing to do, and so I'm only going to write fiction. If I felt that way, then I probably would be better off just throwing up my book on Amazon and getting 100 readers. But I'm interested in writing, and so whether that's writing about how I serialized a book, or about my Web3 novel, or about all of these experiments, that's just as fun for me. So I'm just exploring with my writing in general, and I can see lots of opportunities of ways that I can use my art. For example, I kind of want to write a rap album, which I think would be fun to work with some producer friends on and write in that way, which is essentially poetry that's more well read. And so I'm exploring with all different kinds of ways that I can write.
Right. It's actually very interesting because, the lens in how you see storytelling is opening a lot of avenues for you to explore new things. And of course, each of them have their own sort of audience, and each of them have their own sort of niche and the pros and cons of it. Now, because you worked in both in the Web 2 world and the Web 3 world, one of the challenges in the Web 2 world is definitely there is an option to earn better money compared to let's say publishing in physical books. But here also there is a huge chunk that is given out as commissions to these platforms. For example, Substack charges 10%, and Medium, it's also very difficult to figure out how the Medium numbers or the monetary aspects work. What do you think about the cut that you have to give to these companies as a part of being on the platform?
I know. I think that is so fascinating that's the conversation always goes to the chunk of my money that is then earned by the platforms I'm on. But like, why do people not think about that in traditional publishing? Like, if you publish your book traditionally, you only get 15%, and your agent gets a bunch, like your agent and your publisher get the other 75% of your income. And like, are you willing to pay that? The whole idea is the cost that you're paying going to be worth what you earn? So in the publishing industry, is it worth giving somebody 75% of the earnings of my book because they're gonna market it so much that it's going to become the next Dan Brown novel and see 1 million readers, and it's going to be the next movie that comes out and be optioned, into a musical and all this merchandise? Like, then in that case, if that actually is the case, then maybe that 75% is totally worth it for you to spend, right? Because your book reaches 1 million copies, so you made more than you'd make on your own. On a platform like Substack, is it worth giving them 10% of my income to write on that platform? Yes, absolutely, because they're getting my name out in front of all of these people. They're giving me access to an audience who can subscribe directly to me, and I own it, so I can always take them and leave whenever I want. But I also get all of my audience from my community on Substack. So people are commenting on my articles, and I comment on theirs, and there's a very rich and robust community there that I couldn't get just on my own. Right. And among other platforms, Substack's 10% is way lower than any other platform. I mean, Patreon's is similar. Like, Patreon's is like the most similar to Substack's, but most other platforms take way, way more and don't provide added value. So for me, yeah, Substack is the way to go. It's like a no-brainer.
Right. That's very interesting to hear, because usually in the creators that when we interviewed who are predominantly in other platforms, they always had this challenge of saying that that they're not getting enough paid enough, or the effort that they put into creating this content they've not been able to monetize it enough. But this is very a refreshing take for a writer to say that that they're very much more happy to give that 10% of the Substack, because in the offline world it's even like more difficult to even earn this money.
Oh yeah, totally. Like, not in the offline world, you're spending way more of your revenue for that. So nothing.
Yeah. I just want to ask a couple of final questions. So you have a full-time job and you're writing for Web 2, you're writing for Web 3, and you're thinking about like new ideas and all of it. How do you manage time, and how do you manage burnouts on a daily basis as a creator?
That's a really good question. Right now, I'm writing my newsletter before work, so between the hours of 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. And then I work on my day job, and I'm only able to record this podcast because this is my lunch break. And then I'm going to work on my day job again after this. And then at the end of my work day, then I do the community aspect of my work. So I still respond to all of the comments on my newsletter. And so I do answer everybody's comments that commented, and check to make sure if there's anything I need to talk about on or follow up on Twitter or LinkedIn, and like email people back. And that's when I also do my pitches. So if I'm going to pitch a new story idea to a bunch of journalists, then I'll do that then. And then on the weekends, I'll usually like on Saturday morning or Sunday morning, I'll focus on whatever side project. So right now that's my book proposal that I'm about to pitch. And I just work on that in the morning. On the weekends, and then I have fun. How it's working out right now is that I still have time after work, after 6 p.m. to go, do some yoga or go for a hike or whatever, and kind of unwind. And then on the weekends, I have time to do that, plenty of time to do that as well. But the trade-off is that I'm basically sitting at my computer from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. and that That has been a little bit rough.
Yeah.
I do go outside and try to get a walk or a yoga session in the middle of the day to break it up,
Mhm.
but it has been a lot. And one thing that I learned from my mentor at Substack is, she's writing her newsletter full time. She makes six figures writing her newsletter, and she was saying, like, I was where you were 2 years before I get paid. She's like, the way I see it is you have 2 hard years ahead of you as you like build this whole thing up. But then after that, it's just going to be feeding itself, and you could essentially just do that for your job. So
Right.
that's my goal. My goal is to be able to focus on my newsletter full time by December of 2023. And so I'm like on track to do that right now. And so I still have a long ways to go, but I think if I can kind of manage to find some ease in my life while still doing this, it's still worth it. I mean, I think I had one person phrase this well, or was like, it's one thing to work a lot when you don't like your job, but it's like hard to say no to things you really, really do want to do. And I do want to do everything that I'm doing. So it's been hard for me to kind of give anything up, and I'm trying to focus my time. Like I'm focused more on my newsletter than anything else. So anything I do besides my newsletter and my job will definitely take a back seat, but the two alone are a lot of work.
Right, right. Do you also go on some digital detox when it gets like too much, when you get like too much screen time?
Well, I don't have anything on my phone. So it's only if I'm at my laptop that I'm online. And even now I don't have any social media. Like I have a TikTok, but I don't check it or anything. And I don't have the Twitter app on my phone or anything like that. So on my phone, all I have is like Kindle to read. And so basically all I can do on there is check text messages and read. So when I'm on my computer, yes, I have a bunch going on, but then when my laptop's closed, I'm not really working on any of this stuff.
Right, right, right. So final one simple question. You already talked about it. Your success. What is your goal? Right. If you had to define what does success mean to you, how would you define it?
Well, I already feel that I'm successful personally, and so I don't feel that I need like some further like level of success. I think it'll be fun to see if I can make a living at my newsletter, because how much fun would that be as a writer to just only write for your job, and just
Right.
that like sounds like a dream come true. But I also like don't need that to happen to be happy, It's just like a fun side project to work on. And I do thrive really well on goals. So I like having a goal set for it that I'm working towards. But I feel whether I get there or not, I'll feel successful at the end of the 2 years. So I think for that, it doesn't really matter. But either way, it's just kind of a fun thing to work on. I'm going to write no matter what, because that's how I process the world. Like my newsletter is basically my diary. And so it's just me figuring out things for myself and figuring out my art and like being creative. And yeah, so art is like my like exciting thing to do. And so it's fun for me to like work on that and figure it out. So I'm going to do it regardless of if I'm getting paid to do it or not. So why not figure out if I get paid to do it?
Right, right. I think that applies for any artist. Like, they love or they enjoy doing what they do. And that's something that we have heard repeatedly with creators. Even if I don't get paid, I would still do it because I enjoy doing what I do.
Yeah,
Great,
exactly.
great. Yeah. Awesome. That's all I had for today. Thanks a lot for taking your time and speaking with us. It was an absolute pleasure understanding your journey, and it definitely would be more inspiring for all the new age writers who also think that the publishing is dying and they don't know where to go. And I think this interview would be like great inspiration for them to figure out new ways of writing and making a living.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, and everyone's welcome to subscribe to my newsletter. It's just ellgriffin.substack.com, and we're all figuring it out there together. So come join us.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks a lot.